section characterizing some science and some on-the-ground conditions. I want to bring the science back to the front because the 11-minute video here from the Asia Society mostly focuses on that science. And one of the points that we want to make as Tibet Third Pole, again, is this strong consensus about the conditions of the Tibetan Plateau as climate change is impacting the region.
These are all names for one place, the world's most elevated land, a plateau the size of Western Europe and the birthplace of Asia's many great rivers. Here, culture and tradition are deeply entwined with Mother Nature. But now they face a problem.
The judgment of natural scientists is that the Yangtze source and nearby regions are very sensitive to climate change. Here, it comes sooner than in other areas, and it's more sensitive.
The thing that has just to concern me is places like Mount Inami. So at this site, about 20,000 feet at the source of these big rivers, there has been no net accumulation of snow since at least 1950. That means these glaciers are not just retreating at the margins. They are losing mass from the surface down at the highest point of the glacier. Whether we're talking about the Himalayas or the Andes or the ice fields of Africa, it's all the same story. The isotopes are saying the temperatures are warming, the glaciers are retreating in all these places.
In more than 30 years studying glaciers, Thompson has gone on 54 expeditions to 15 countries. Quilcaya in Peru has lost 25% of its ice in 30 years. Although Peru was once 80% powered by hydroelectricity, it now has had to build coal-fired plants to make up for the shortfall during the dry season, when hydro turbines often run at only 20% of capacity.
And you can think of a glacier as a water bank account that has been built up for thousands of years. And in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century, we are taking more out of that bank account than is being put in. And we know long term, pretty soon it's gone.
Chinese scientists estimate that China's glaciers are melting away a whole Yellow River's worth of water every year. With the current trend, China will have lost 2/3 of its glacial ice cover by the end of this century. This estimate, however, does not factor in the complication of accelerating warming, which is commonplace in glacial territories.
A lot of snow and ice caps have melted, but many only see a topic for academic discussion. The problem actually very much affects people's livelihoods here. For example, nomads used to start milking yachts and making butter in May. Now production is delayed until July, which means the nomads have 2 fewer months of income. We did home interviews with 200 nomadic families, and we found what nomads say exactly matches what scientists have found. The locals just have a different way of saying it.
We now have ice core records going back 800,000 years. Those records provide us a history of greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. There's no analog to where we are now in an 800,000 year history that we have in the bubbles of the gases in these ice cores.
The nomads have names for each of the sequential weather patterns in Tibet. The pre-rainy season snowfalls, or the early summer showers. They plan out herding according to sequential monsoon patterns.
They don't look at a calendar. They look at the sun, the moon, stars, and plants on the ground to make decisions about their lives and ranching. What grass to eat in winter, where to graze in the summer. Their seasonal knowledge is very rich, but things have been chaotic in recent years. Their traditional common sense doesn't work anymore.
In the early 1990s, Tashi Dorje joined his mentor, Jesang Sonandajie, on a mission to protect Tibetan antelopes in Kekeshili, a 20 million acre wilderness in western Yushu Prefecture. He left environmental work for politics, rising quickly to the post of spokesman for the county of Zhiduo, but he couldn't leave behind his deep passion for the grassland and its people. In the late 1990s, Tashi Dorje left politics to once again begin traveling around the plateau, educating villagers and their children on ecological issues with his photos, slideshows, and films.
老虎是猫科动物中体型最大的，它们用强有力的爪子和牙齿捕杀猎物，以中和其他小动物。由于丧失栖息地和食物，所有的猎物吃老虎都面临绝种威胁，但最致命的原因是盗猎。
Tashi Dorje is concerned about the well-being of nomads and their herds, and the preservation of the way of life that he believes is an integral part of the plateau's pastoral ecosystem.
Now there are fewer and fewer yaks and sheep, and some families don't keep any herds at all. The government policy seems to imply the fewer the better, or even having no herds is better. Coupled with the push of urbanization, nomads are more likely to give it up themselves.
Glaciers aren't the only things melting in Tibet. Permafrost, the layer of frozen earth that holds water near the surface of the soil, provides moisture to the meadows and other vegetation above ground. The sinking and thinning of permafrost has drained the water supply and, along with warmer temperatures and intensifying evaporation, turned pastures into sand dunes or desertified slopes. Lakes and rivers have shrunk, endangering fish, gazelle, and other local species. Also damaged are houses and roads that sit atop of the permafrost.
The most important problem is to communicate the changes and ecological issues with scientists using data and maps, which sometimes we don't understand at all. We can tell one story after another to scientists all day long, but we are forced to learn a language they can understand.
Sometimes when we talk about climate change, we talk more about temperature. 3 degrees warmer, that will be tough, and there'll be extreme heat waves and things like that. But if you don't have water, this essence of life, people have to migrate, and there's unrest that comes with that. This is a global problem. Many of the mountain glaciers in the world will disappear. If we were to lose 8% of the ice that is now on land, we're looking at 5 to 6 meters of sea level rise.
For many years, Tibet has elicited enormous interest, particularly in the West, because of its remoteness, majesty of its mountains, its religion, and more recently, of course, its political situation. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of Tibet, as we've come to realize, is its environmental significance. So we hope that you will stay with us and enjoy the historic interactive images of glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau, which will show you in the most graphic way how things have changed.
So we have this consensus of the science related to how climate change is affecting the Tibetan Plateau and its ecosystem services, the resources that people rely on. Those are numerous. The most important is twofold. It relates to water resources and to the health of the grasslands, because as my colleague pointed out, an overwhelming majority of the Tibetan Plateau is grassland in its vegetation composition. I want to shift gears a little bit because there's another dimension to this story that needs to be told, and that is China's incredible and still continuing development in the last 30 years since the opening up in 1979. China's policies have included the phrase "develop first, clean up second." And the environmental consequences of this policy of genuinely and importantly providing development for the Chinese people, 1.3 billion, a huge task. But the consequences of that development have meant pollution, water pollution, air pollution to be sure, but we're going to focus on water pollution. Something on the order of 70% of China's rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and groundwater is polluted, and polluted badly. Agricultural runoff, industry are the culprits in this. So China has this water crisis. Its economy is still growing, its population is still growing, turning this crisis into a looming catastrophe. China's solution to this is up on the Tibetan Plateau, and I can think of no better way to sum up that solution in this way. Everybody outside of China refers to the Tibetan Plateau as Asia's water tower. In China, they speak about it as China's #1 water tower. And the difference in a national sense, in a sovereignty sense, versus a regional shared resource is significant for all of us and for the policy consequences of how what is about to happen and currently happening in Tibet. So China has this water crisis. To solve it, it needs to do two things. One is it needs to solve the water quantity crisis, water supply. China has on the books, in planning stages, in building stages, and already completed, plans to build approximately 100 large dams across the Tibetan Plateau and in the eastern borderlands region between the edge of the Tibetan Plateau and lower land China. In addition to those dams, you've captured water, now you have to move it because the only two major rivers of something on the order of 10 major rivers start on the Tibetan Plateau and drain into Asia. The only major ones that drain into China are the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. China has besides its water pollution crisis, it's already a fairly dry region, exacerbating its water pollution and water supply needs. So China has plans to divert water from these dams. This is a huge engineering challenge, unlike human civilization has ever imagined, never mind implemented. There is no guarantee that they will achieve this, and I would not want to be a Chinese planner in the national government and go to my bosses one day and say, these diversions are not going to work. We need another source of water. There aren't any others for China. Now, that's China's water quantity problem. China's water quality problem, according to China, is rooted, again, on the grasslands of Tibet. Their goal is to do broad landscape-scale conservation of the grasslands. And China's model for conservation is conservation, no humans. It's an old model. The idea of a national park can't have humans because it's pristine. China's been using that word pristine and harmony in characterizing what their goals are for these areas. An area the size of Western Europe, a significant proportion of that Western Europe size is tilted towards China. So the majority of the lands of the Tibetan Plateau will be put under some form of conservation, and with that, the obligation in China's eyes to remove people from there. Now, we know for millennia, 4,000 years, say Chinese archaeologists, and 8,000 years, say other archaeologists, that there has been nomadism, pastoralism on the grasslands of Tibet. And we know that in those millennia, 4 to 8 millennia, that the nomads have persisted in their livelihood practices and adapted. You've all heard of the Little Ice Age that hit Europe starting in the 1300s. That Little Ice Age affected Tibet, and yet the nomads were still there, and they're still there now. Catch my breath here and see where I'm going with this. Yes, water quality. There has been, in the last 50 years of China's land use policies and practices, a degradation of the grassland resource. In the film, we saw nomads talking about the degradation of the grasslands. That causal mechanism is believed to be climate change. Tibet is already arid and semi-arid. That is getting worse. But the other sort of twin punch, if you will, towards the degradation of the grasslands has to do with China's land use practices. China now has a degraded grassland ecosystem over a significant amount of the overall grasslands area, and that in turn, there you go. That in turn will have an impact on groundwater, and that in turn will have an impact on the quality of water draining to China. And so their solution is to remove the nomads from their traditional livelihood practices, from where they have lived, in an effort, a misguided effort to say the least, to undertake a crisis intervention conservation on behalf of their own shrinking water supply. Now, I want to talk quickly about a couple of solutions here. Tibet Third Pole is calling for the removal, or to stop removing the nomads from the grasslands. We saw here, towards the latter third of this brief film, Hashitashi Dorje and others are trying to do community participation in planning and adapting to changing conditions. Whether those conditions are changing because of climate change or because of failed policies is secondary. The two of them interact and are driving a general degradation. The ability to adapt to your own livelihood practices is a fundamental human right that we'll come back to later, probably in the question and answer period. So we're calling for the Chinese government to stop removing the nomads. The nomads have a traditional ecosystem knowledge that has persisted and co-evolved with these conditions for millennia. Their livelihood practices are stewardship-based. Use but don't abuse. Those have persisted for millennia. And third, Tibetan nomads are Buddhists, and which links their practices and their knowledge to a deeply held sense of ethics and morality. We need that. This entire planet, this entire COP15 needs exemplars of how to live on the planet using without abusing. So Tibet's nomads removing them is over here. Over here is that they are a model for living on the planet in the 21st century.
A common misunderstanding is that nomadic people wander about randomly to find new pasture. This is far from the case. Everywhere nomads depend on seasonal changes of temperature, rainfall and grass growth, and their patterns of movement follow the seasons. This means that the principles of movement are fixed, although the actual movements from season to season will depend on the shifting ecological conditions in the local area from season to season and from valley to valley. These movements are meticulously adapted to both the specialized needs of the individual types of animals and to the needs of the people. Nomads always return to a given location, however, and especially in cold climates, their winter quarters tend to be the same from year to year. Another common misunderstanding is that pastoral nomads are primitive tribesmen that prefer being left alone and for whom animal herding is sufficient for their daily needs. Nomadic livestock herders are far from being self-sufficient. Just herding animals and living on animal protein is not at all efficient and not very healthy either. Livestock herders depend on exchanging animal products for vital foodstuffs such as grain, oil, sugar, and tea, and for various tools, weapons, and equipment. The more they can exchange, the better they're off. Another important point is that modernity, the development over the last 100 years in East Asia, has radically altered the balance between nomadic and sedentary cultures. In the pre-modern period, nomadic peoples were powerful, technologically advanced, and as individuals far wealthier than the sedentary peasants of East Asia who constantly struggled with overpopulation, scarce land, and periodic hunger. That balance is tipping rapidly. In the modern period, economic, political, and technological development has revolutionized urban life and placed unprecedented means of power in the hands of central governments. The high grasses in the valleys are crucial winter reserves that the animals depend on for survival in winter. Other types of land use, such as roads, industries, small towns, even prisons, dam building, have encroached upon old pasture land over a 50-year period. The overall consequences of these several developments has been a sweeping marginalization of the previously so proud and powerful nomadic peoples of Central Asia. They have not only lost their political independence, but also their negotiating power in relation to the urban-based civilizations. Comparing Tibet and Mongolia, mainly historical coincidence accounts for differences that are seen today. Tibet and Mongolia were culturally linked for hundreds of years by Tibetan Buddhism. That was also one of the key cultural markers in Mongolia. Throughout Mongolia, there were Buddhist monasteries with hundreds or thousands of resident lamas. They were also linked by similar patterns of nomadic pastoralism, which provided strong cultural and intellectual bonds, although town development and professional specialization tended to be more advanced in Tibet. They herded the same kinds of animals: sheep, goats, horses, cattle, yak, camels, and so forth. International politics and coincidence placed Mongolia under Soviet control and Tibet under Chinese control. Further political events, such as the collapse of the Soviet Union and China's economic reform process, have resulted in Mongolia's emergence as an open democratic society, while Tibet only sank deeper into dependency on authoritarian repressive governments. The main difference between Mongolia and Tibet is this. In Mongolia, government agencies, international organizations, NGOs, experts, and local communities strive to achieve such aims, not without problems, of course. In Tibet, the Chinese authorities feel no responsibility whatsoever in the protection of the rights of local communities, and the will of the state in terms of water security and securing its own political survival reigns supreme. In Mongolia today, the pastoral livestock sector still engages half of the population and contributes about a third of the GNP. After several years of extreme winters around 2000, when millions of livestock died, the livestock numbers have increased rapidly since. and today it's higher than ever in Mongolian history. There is by and large open access to grazing for nomadic herders, although the borders of traditional administrative areas are respected. In times of natural disasters or serious environmental stress, it is convention that herders seek grazing for their animals in other localities or even in distant regions. In Mongolia, a national initiative for climate change vulnerability and adaptation in the livestock sector was established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Hundreds of Mongolian researchers from all disciplines have been engaged in this research, working with local communities all over the country. Many or all of these researchers have themselves intimate relationships with herder communities, since Mongolia was only urbanized very late. To combat the increasing occurrence of extreme weather, such as hot and dry summers or extremely cold winters with snow cover, a multitude of local projects have been initiated. These include energy conservation, renewable energy, better livestock protection, winter fodder production, pasture restoration, improved human nutrition, wildfire protection, community training programs, and so forth. Substantial donor funding is available for local adaptation projects, for instance from the UN, ADB, World Bank, bilateral donors, and NGOs. What most obviously characterizes the situation in Mongolia, however, is that local communities are free to work with any partner they choose. Nomadic herders and NGOs may work with their governments to find solutions to local adaptation problems. And local communities are free to invite foreign experts and donor organizations to work with them and support their own initiatives. For successful climate change adaptation, politics matter. Climate change adaptation in sensitive areas take the will to cooperation between all stakeholders. And to secure public participation, it takes respect for the traditional livelihoods of local communities. A long range of rights come into play in this process, such as the access to political representation, even furthermore, the right to political participation and democratic government, the freedom of speech, minorities' right to protection, free access to information, both in printed media and the new digital media, free access to organizing and to cooperation with NGOs in order to achieve an active civil society. Thank you.